Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hello, my name is Jaleesa Boltron, and I am on the diversity chair for MHCCF.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Como. I am the Diversity Chair for Central Florida Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. We are so happy to see you all joining us this evening for another collaborative event by the Mental Health Counselor Association of Central Florida, alongside the Central Florida Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. We are excited to dive right in to highlight our panelists who are here to speak to you about our topic today, a collective experience addressing racial trauma and healing in Black mental health.
MHCCF and CFAMFT are excited to be collaborating on our second diversity event. We also would like to acknowledge that July is BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. BIPOC stands for Black Indigenous People of Color. Today, we will focus on the Black experience. We do recognize that the Black experience in other communities of color overlap in some ways. However, there are unique experiences that we want to focus on today. Our intention is to present more continued discussions in the future on various diversity topics. So if there's a topic that you are interested in and would like to raise more awareness about, please feel free to reach out to me, Jaleesa, or Melissa, and we could help you with that. So we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. In the classroom, she creates an environment in each session that encourages clients to be comfortable in their own skin and heal at their own pace. As a private practice owner, she focuses on guiding her clients on their journey of self-discovery and finding their voice in life.
Now we'd like to introduce Dr. Micah Johnson. He is a sociologist trained in criminology and substance misuse epidemiology, currently serving in the Department of Mental Health, Law and Policy at the University of South Florida. Dr. Johnson's research focuses on childhood trauma, behavioral health, and juvenile justice, and is funded by over $2 million in grants from the National Institute of Health. Dr. Johnson is also a pioneer of forensic sociology, serves in the state and federal court system as an expert witness and mitigation specialist. His work has been cited by the New York Times, Senator Bernie Sanders, and others. Dr. Johnson recently published 2 books entitled Never Had a Friend and The Little Book of Police Youth Dialogues, a restorative path toward justice.
Okay, next we have Dr. Brittany Peters, and she has over 14 years of experience in community mental health as a clinician, advocate, consultant, and clinical director, as a licensed clinical social worker, certified in addictions, and an approved qualified supervisor. Dr. Peters devotes much of her time to improving clinical services in the community through the training and development of counselors and other professionals. Dr. Peters is the current chair of the Health and Wellness Community with the, I've never known how to say that county, Pinellas, thank you, Pinellas County, Urban League Young Professionals, co-chair of the Tampa Bay chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, the Behavioral Health Interest Chair for the NASW statewide, is trained as part of the statewide crisis intervention rapid response team, and serves on the board of directors for the Pinellas County National Alliance on Mental Illness.
Now we have our 4th panelist, Brian Adderley. He is a licensed clinical social worker who has over 7 years of correctional mental health experience. He has earned his master's degree in social work and his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Central Florida. He has a passion for working with, uplifting, and advocating, as well as holding space for the most systemically oppressed populations. So these are our panelists. Thank you for being here. And we are excited to have you all here with us. We are all ready and we're listening. So we'll go ahead and start. We thought it was important to start with the definition of racial trauma, right? That's what we're here to talk about. So last year, so we'll go ahead and start. We thought it was important to start with the definition of racial trauma, right? That's what we're here to talk about. So last year, for those of you who hadn't attended our previous combined event, we focused on racial trauma and kind of getting a sense of what that topic was about. This year, we really wanted to focus on the healing aspect of that. But as you all know, as clinicians, it's important to understand the starting point of the problem before we can heal from it. So to talk about racial trauma, we wanted to have a definition for you. So what we have is racial trauma, a form of race-based stress, refers to people of color and indigenous individuals' reactions to dangerous events and whether real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination. Such experiences may include threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing racial discrimination toward other people of color. Although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. We will also have the definition in the chat for those who'd like to refer back. So we'll go ahead and start with our first question. To the panelists, whoever wants to start, the question is, how does racial trauma impact the collective? When we say collective, we mean the Black community.
I think for me is looking at collective. What does that mean? We can break that up into so many different variants. Collective for the Black community within our local communities, like, for example, Avalon Park, Oviedo, Eagle Creek, collective in local. So Orange County, Osceola County, Pinellas County, national, for United States, Canada, Mexico, and then worldwide in international sense. So that's what I would like to touch on, especially, bring the minds for our panelists, is that when we look at a collective sense, we can really break that down so many different variants.
Thanks, Taylor.
And add to that, what I'll say is that for our professionals that are in the room or those who are new learners, when we have a question posed to us about how racial trauma impacts the collective, many of us are familiar as professionals with vicarious trauma, right? And so you have to understand that when for racial trauma in our community, what tends to happen is that we are storytellers, and so we pass those things down, right? And it tends to impact a lot of the decisions that we make. So when you are working with individuals, you want to make sure that even if they have not directly experienced it, keep in mind how that may have been passed down to them from their parents, right? It affects our everyday life. It helps us to learn rules of engagement. So when we see violence happening from law enforcement towards the Black and Brown community, that then transfers into not just our stress, but then what we tell each other about how we can engage with them, right? And what we can do and what we cannot do. So I think that the collective in general, again, we're always shifting our rules of engagement with the community as a result of racial trauma. And so we have to consider that as an important lens when we're working clinically with individuals.
I just want to jump and piggyback on that, that these mechanisms are diverse. So one mechanism could be a sociological mechanism, how the systemic issues that exist in society continue to permeate, and therefore it impacts the collective in that way through generations and generations, because social systems are really slow to change. Societal change is very slow. So these issues tend to permeate. Another mechanism could be through folklore, right? The other piece of socialization that Dr. Peters is talking about, just handing down these survival kits that are in themselves prepping folks to be oppressed or traumatized. Another mechanism could be this sort of genetic sort of mechanism where by your trauma gets inside of your skin and becomes a part of it. And like scientists study, how does social issues, how do these experiences get under the skin to impact generations and generations? So another mechanism is that epigenetic one that sort of merges the biological and the physiological with the sociological. So all these mechanisms are means by which this experience of anti-Black racism or racial trauma, or just racial trauma in general for all folks of color, how it begins to impact individuals, impact the collective, and impact subsequent generations.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So if the panelists want, I can move on to the next question. Not everyone has to answer each question, but if you have something, just let me know. Next question, what is your understanding of the impact of racial trauma that it has on, we just said the collective, but now we're talking about the individual's mental health, the family's mental health, and the community's mental health?
I think that this is such an important question, right? About the impact that we see on an individual's mental health, the family, the community, right? Not too long ago, we learned about adverse childhood experiences, right? And I think that assuming most of us know about that, when you look at what that study said, right, is that our health disparities, the impact of trauma, early childhood trauma on the developing brain, then results in later health problems, right? And we're not just talking about diabetes, right? We're talking about high blood pressure. We are talking about heart disease, right? But then let's couple that, right? And let's move a little further into adverse community experiences, right? And how that plays a role, right? So if we know that for adverse childhood experiences, right, a parent going to jail, a parent living with mental health or having substance misuse, right? Even those separations from parents during childhood, for racial trauma, we couple that in, and what we find is that if we're at risk for developing mental health disorders or substance use disorders or diabetes as a result of being exposed to these traumas within our home, imagine if we add to that when we leave the home, right, in our communities, in our schools. So when we think about that, we also have to, especially as clinicians, we have to be mindful of the clients that we're seeing. And I think it's so important to make sure that we address those adverse community experiences and the impact that that has on your child client who may be walking to school and be worried, right? Being mindful that Black and brown children, when you see them in therapy sessions, law enforcement may not have been a positive experience for them, right? So how that plays a role in some of the anxiety or some of the depressive symptoms that you may see. Also for adults, when you are seeing, I tend to work with a lot of adults who are child welfare involved, right? And so here is another system where there is a high perception, and rightfully so, there are valid concerns where we want to make sure that we are not continuing to impact an individual's mental health without addressing the valid concerns they have about the system of care as a whole.
Absolutely. And, Dr. Peters had a great hint on education. I have 4 years experience teaching at Title I high school. And a lot of my brown and Black students come in not just with the mental health of the home life, but the mental health of the, external factors, their perceptions with law enforcement, not always a positive, systematic oppressions of going through, different areas of town and being looked at differently. And so coming into the classroom, they have all this weight on their shoulders. And now I taught science, biology. And so they're not focused on passing my class. They're focused on, I have all these other stressors, especially placed on the outside world on my shoulders. And so your average 13, 14, 15-year-old, you think, okay, just go to school. For these kids, it's not just go to school, it's survival. And so as a clinician, it's really being understanding of those other factors they're facing, not just in the home, but in the world and the cosmos they're interacting with.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Well, before we go on to the next question, we also want to define an important term for you all, trauma-informed care. I would also be in the chat as well. So the definition we have is trauma-informed care shifts the focus from what is wrong with you to what's happened to you. A trauma-informed approach to care acknowledges that healthcare organizations and care teams need to have a complete picture of a patient's or client's life situation, past and present, in order to provide effective healthcare services with a healing orientation. And so the next question then, as we hold that definition in our minds, how can trauma-informed care benefit Black lives?
I guess. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay. Okay. So trauma-informed care can benefit all populations, especially Black populations, due to the racial trauma that we experience. Like you said in the definition, the trauma-informed care takes you from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. In a way, in a sense, it takes you from feeling like you are wrong for experiencing the trauma in the event, and it lets you know that you are outside of the trauma event. The trauma happened to you, but you are not the trauma. And it can put you in a place of empowerment. It can put you on that first step to seeing the trauma outside of yourself, and give you to find your strength and to find your healing.
Right, and so this a trauma-informed lens allows folks to see a whole human being, all the complexities of who we are, how we think, how we act, how we dream, even the way we love. All of this is shaped by these multidimensional social factors. And each of us is shaped, again, by these biographical experiences. We're shaped by a family background. We're shaped by a position in society. We're shaped by relationships with institutions, with schools, with governments, with institutions. We cannot understand ourselves, each other, and the world around us without understanding these sort of biographical forces and the historical factors that influence us. So before taking steps towards healing, a physician asks a patient about their background, their family history, their living conditions. If we're to sort of mend the harm caused by historical and contemporary traumas, particularly among Blacks and folks of color, we must take steps to understand those historical and contemporary context, that historical and contemporary context that sort of defines their lived experiences. A trauma-informed approach integrates a trauma-informed approach that integrates and appreciates the impact of historical trauma and systemic racism. These sorts of approaches can humanize and destigmatize Black skin. And so that's sort of the benefit. The benefit is sort of releasing this oppressive sort of lived experiences that many folks have to navigate life with.
And I also add to Dr. Johnson and Brian as they talk about trauma-informed care, right? I want to acknowledge that probably many of us in the room have taken a trauma-informed care training at our organization, right? And so when you hear this come up again, you probably immediately think, oh, I got that. We have that every year. We have to take it for in-service or for CEUs.
Right.
But you know, so we want to go beyond this idea of just going to training, but also recognizing that when we're saying trauma-informed care, we're saying, you know, what has happened to you. You have to keep in mind that there are multiple realities of life in America for many, right? And so we're talking about the Black experience. And so it's important when working with individuals that whether or not you agree with it, because you know, I try to be real about things when I'm working with individuals, that there are those of us, there are clinicians who go home and really don't think that the Black experience is as bad, right? And so what I want to say, right? We acknowledge that everyone views the world differently, but when you're working with a person of color, especially an individual from the Black community, your role is to understand their experience and work with them through the lens of trauma-informed care, whether or not you believe that what is going on or that systemic racism or any of these things are as bad as you may think, right? It is about the client's experience. And so we want to hold space to make sure that you're prepared to receive what they're telling you about their reality and their experience of being Black in America.
Thank you, panelists. So next question. With all the trauma and pain that is currently present, how can therapists provide a safe place for their Black clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing is hold space for them. Meet them where they're at. That's absolutely one. I can piggyback what Dr. Peters was saying is like, just because your experience in life is not the same as your client doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We have close to almost 8 billion people on this planet. That's 8 billion different stories, different life experiences, different exposures. And so if we come in with that lens as a clinician that my Black and brown people are going through some amazing trauma right now, for especially historically. And so if I understand that their life's the door. Oh, sorry.
I think you're delayed. I was just
me?
checking now. Yeah, now.
Okay, you got me?
Yeah.
Okay. And so if we have that mindset that it opens the door for those conversations to begin, because I saw a pop-up question in the chat of how do you get the conversation started? You know, is asking them what has their life been? How difficult was that? You know, what was that choice like for you? What options were provided for you? What were those frustrations? If we go along those lines, it really opens the space for honest communication and from at a place where it's just learning about your clients and how you can best serve them.
And I agree with Ms. Taylor a lot with that. Just speaking off my experience being in therapy and having a therapist who was a white female, I had a lot of guards up. And one of the first things she did in our session, one of the first things she said was, hey, Brian, I'm a white female. I'm a white cisgender straight female. And she kind of put everything on the table as far as our differences. And what that did, you know, you would think that the differences would separate us, but what it did is it allows us to get everything out, any apprehension I had, any anxieties I had about our identities and what she thought about it. It showed me that she was, one, comfortable discussing these things. She wasn't afraid on how it would make her feel. She was more concerned about creating a safe space and holding space for me and my multiple identities and knowing and being aware of her differences. And I think that that's a lesson that I learned, you know, being a patient that I utilize with my clients is, hey, you know, any differences we have that I can see, I'm gonna let you know up front, hey, let's talk about this. I'm willing, I'm able, and I wanna be here for you. And I think that's a great strategy as well.
I love that Brian is sharing his experience, right? Because I think that's important, right? We never want, non-BIPOC clinicians to think that they cannot approach minority clients and be able to serve them in a healthy way, right? What I heard was validation. What I can add to that is I do a lot of clinical supervision for those who are seeking full licensure. And with that, I talk to my interns about making sure that when we say whole space, is that you ask your clients how they are doing. So one of the things, one of the biggest things, right, that happened last year was George Floyd, right, the murder of George Floyd. So around that time, I thought that it was the most appropriate time to talk about making sure that when your clients come into that therapy session, that there are no elephants in the room, right, that we are checking in on them. If we see adverse community experiences happening on the news or we hear about in our local community, in the Black community, and you're seeing a client, ask them how that may be impacting their mental health, right? Are you seeing an increase in your anxiety? Are you seeing your PTSD be triggered? You know, what is going on for you? Because oftentimes what happens for minorities is that they're coming into sessions and they're scared to talk because they're worried about their clinicians' feelings, especially when they don't look like them, right? So I know that can be scary a lot of times when you are working with someone who does not look like you. But in Brian's experience, it is really just put it out there, right? And I can talk for myself that when a lot of this was going on, it was probably more traumatizing to me that a lot of people in the world were acting as if nothing had happened, right? Yet when we see the World Trade Centers, when we saw 9/11 happen, everyone remembers where they were, everyone was in shock. We hold visuals, right? And so we're not just speaking about Black History Month, but there are things that go on throughout the year that we want to make sure, like, check on me. Your job sends out emails, happy this month, or our hearts are with people, happy Father's Day. But check in on your clients, not just about those kind of things, but about how what's happening in the world and in their communities impacts them, right? So our first question was about racial trauma in the collective, and how it impacts the individual, then the community. And so bring that into the session.
Thank you. And I did see some questions in the chat, and panelists, if you feel the urge to answer within your answers, feel free to do that. We are going to try to keep space for the end to answer people's questions. So for the audience, feel free to put them in the chat. We're not necessarily going to them in between the questions. We're going to try to wait to the end, but I do encourage the panelists, if you see something that pulls you, please feel free to answer that as well. We're going to go on to the next question. I'm actually gonna, I don't know if you all have it in front of you, but I'm gonna move on to one question to kind of get us closer to where we wanna be. What are some ways we can help individuals effectively cope with systemic oppression?
I think one of the ways you can help individuals cope with it is being aware and having available some resources to help individuals create communities. So if you're aware of these individuals' systemic racism, obstacles and things they face, you can refer them to groups with individuals who have similar issues, who face similar issues, so that they can feel validated, heard, and kind of work through, process some of their experiences with people who have experienced similar things. I think that's a great way to help individuals.
Another thing is do the research, and don't just take everything from face value. Just in the last 12 months, we see a lot of headlines come out, right? Dig some deeper on it, especially things that affect systematically. There's so many different systematic oppressions in the education system, in housing development, roadways, traffic, sewage, water systems. Dig a little deeper, and that don't just think, oh, my experience doesn't relate to it. A lot of things you can find the information for on valid resources to really understand the historical context of those deep-rooted segregation, that it may not be blatantly in your face as often anymore, but it's really in the subtext of it, how different roadways specifically grow through certain communities than others, how different funding goes for water resources, or even, for example, food deserts are specifically designed. So those are some ways to kind of, understand where are the systematic oppressions happening and occurring for our Black and Brown communities, and kind of understanding the historical context of it.
I've taught a ton of different types of students from 8 years old to 80, mostly teaching race among adults or at the college level. And when you're teaching stuff like systemic oppression, there are some negative feelings that come up. When folks are sort of made aware of certain predicaments, or they're reminded, or they experience some of these deeply traumatic experiences, there's a lot of hurt. Folks of color hurt, and also folks who are white or other sort of demographic backgrounds, they hurt as well. And what I find that works is sort of helping people have sort of a paradigm shift, because they sort of feel sort of hopeless and powerless. And so one way folks learn to heal and cope is by shifting their perspective and being fully aware and appreciating their own agency and their power. Right. So that's one perspective, is like completely shifting the way they view the world and themselves, and their sense of being oppressed, or their sense of being helpless in an oppressive system. So freedom sort of starts, or freedom and healing starts, I think, with this mentality or a perspective or view of oneself or the world around them. Also, I want to emphasize a point that was made about reading and studying, because that is it's a helpful way of coping. The more you learn, the more you arm yourself with knowledge. Again, this is across the board. These are folks who are victims, and folks who empathize, and folks who feel like they are victims, even if they're white, because they don't want to live in a racist world. They also have hurt. So reading more, studying more, the usual self-care. But for BIPOC folks, embracing your culture, there's a lot of cultural genocide that occurred, a lot of cultural suppression, appropriation. Embracing your culture and your truth is a really healthy and powerful way of coping. And perhaps the most powerful way I've seen, at least with my students, has been to get involved, get engaged, get more involved in the solution. And that helps a lot with coping and dealing with some of these sort of racial traumas. And finally, it's so come from a place of a love for humanity, not just hate of your circumstances, but hate of oppression. I hate when anyone is oppressed, not just me. I think that helps to broaden the perspective, because then it becomes about falling in love with the human family, not just protecting yourself or defending yourself because you're a victim of racism or oppression. It becomes about, I hate when people hurt, or I want no one to have that sort of feeling of oppression, no matter who they are, no matter their race, gender, class, etc.
Thank you. Next question. Are there any therapeutic interventions or techniques that you find most effective in your work with Black clients?
So an approach that I find very effective with working with my patients, my clients, is an intersectional approach. I'm doing my best all the time to see the patient as a whole, full human being. And for POC and Black people especially, an intersectional approach allows for compounding identities and intersections and unique experiences of discrimination for Black people. Anti-Blackness shows up the same way, right, for a lot of Black people, but at the same time, very different. It goes through a filter of gender, of sexuality, of social economic status, and all of these things can be compounded on top of each other to create a very unique experience. And being aware of these experiences and seeing Black people as not a monolith, but unique individuals with a shared history is very empowering and very effective with working with individuals. It's very effective with creating a safe space, and very effective with allowing them to feel seen and empowered, using these identities for strength, and using these identities for education, so that they can navigate these systems to their best ability and seek their healing.
I'll just throw out there also narrative therapy. Oftentimes we come at it from a CBT approach, which I do like, but we want to be careful with CBT, because CBT identifies that there are cognitive distortions or irrational thought processes, and we don't want to invalidate the Black experience with that, right? So we want to adjust it. But you can also weave in a little bit of narrative therapy. Again, I said that we are storytellers as a people, right? When we tell stories through acting, through music. If you listen to a lot of our music, a lot of that stuff, we talk about trauma. And so keep in mind that doing that, but being able to draw in on how we can, through stories, possibly change that narrative. It can be beneficial to us, right? Like, what if I wrote myself as a superhero to end depression, or whatever the case may be. I also saw a question briefly in the chat about social justice. And so I want to just weave that in there, right? Because our last question was about coping with the systemic oppression. And although I love the question, I also know that it's important to help people get through, but also to continually address the injustices that are contributing, right? So one of the things that's most important to me is working outside of the therapy session with the community to make sure that we are addressing some of these laws, these rules, programs that don't really serve to really help change some of the systems that are contributing to how individuals are feeling. And it's a part of our code of ethics as social workers, and I always say that, but I think it's important that clinicians do get involved. We don't want to continue to say, well, that's how it is, you just have to adjust. We want to say, people are out here working to change that, working to combat these laws or these foundations that really are oppressive to our people.
And I just want to add real quick on that change. It doesn't have to be national. Change can be within even your own office space and within the circle of people you interact, having tough conversations with other colleagues where you hear things that, that sounds like a microaggression. That sounds like, not being really for, the, advocacy of Black and brown people, even though they claim they are, having those pulling colleagues to side and having one-on-one and kind of, in a sense, low-key checking people when you hear things that maybe seem offbeat. That can be another form of social justice work where you're pushing that narrative of change, but maybe not as large scale if you're not ready for that ring of fight.
And I love what Taylor just said. So I am a person of a little bit of humor. It's one of our coping skills in the community. But what I'm going to say is, if you never hear it, I'm going to tell you, the space is very important. Your website, what you put out, what you post, because for Black and brown people, we talk to each other and we ask, is the environment colored friendly, right? Are they okay with us coming? We do that, right? We do that amongst ourselves because sometimes we are worried, right? We want to prepare ourselves to go into certain spaces. So if you are trying to make sure that you are attracting clients and making your clients feel comfortable, it boils down to, when you look at job websites, anything that you post on social media. I actually had a clinical intern who was white. I sent her over to the Urban League because they help small businesses get started, right? And they have a program. Anyone can go. But she went to the website and then she gave me a call. She said, "Hey, Dr. Brittany." I said, "What's up?" She goes, "I just want to know, is it okay for me to get services there? Because all the people on the website they're Black. So am I still able to get it?" And it was the first time that she had the experience we have all the time. And so I say that to say that, as you're doing this, Ms. Taylor is absolutely right. It's just as small as, every now and again, put some person with textured hair and some color on your social media, right? And be mindful of that, that there's a spectrum and we want to make people feel comfortable.
Thank you. So next question, probably could have asked this earlier, but I think it still fits where we're at now. How can therapists identify racial trauma? So this question comes from the idea of we oftentimes go to diagnosis and DSM and that kind of thing. So when we think about this question and we think about our clinical work, how does that fit? So how can therapists identify racial trauma?
So this is important to me because we do talk about DSM diagnoses, and so what I'll say for this is that it is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. We do not have anything else in the DSM currently to really account for that. There's been other things posed. There's post-traumatic slave disorder from Dr. Joy DeGruy. But really what I want to challenge many clinicians to do is to be mindful when looking at that criteria. Again, it goes back to just because you don't agree with the experience or believe that it is valid, if post-traumatic stress allows for that clinician to go, this person has experienced either directly or indirectly a trauma that is now impacting them. They're having either dreams or nightmares, right? Racing thoughts. There's a lot that kind of goes into that. But be mindful as a licensed clinician that that allows us to remove or challenge any diagnoses or misdiagnoses. And oftentimes, Black and brown people as children are misdiagnosed as having oppositional defiant disorder, right? Being unable to regulate their mood or respect authority. And so it lends itself not only for us as clinicians to really look at that clinical criteria, but to make sure that we're appropriately diagnosing individuals and not being dismissive towards their experience in the communities that they live in, right? So don't just assume that someone has an issue with authority or an anger problem, whereas this may be a result of racial trauma, and the way that is manifesting itself is through anger, or is through different symptoms that may not look like someone else. But don't discount that that individual is not living with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of racial trauma.
Which is absolutely important. And that's, the biggest thing when you're meeting with clients is understanding their stories, their full stories. And it's going to take time because, in the Black community specifically, it's still a stigma to open up to clinicians. Even though we recognize we need help, we know we're struggling, and so we finally get there, it's still that barrier to cross. And the best thing to kind of broach that is be consistent, being authentic, and being receptive to hearing their story, all of it, and then you're going to be able to peel back the different layers to truly identify what is the main thing. Because, oftentimes, like Dr. Pierce says, our Black kids, are misdiagnosed. I saw it all the time as a teacher. ODD. It was like, well, what's happening at home? Oh, they're the sole provider for their family at 14. They are, going through, a rough neighborhood trying to focus on school, and their parents are working 2-3 jobs. Or, they saw this or that. And so it's really peeling back those layers of our clients and really asking, and it goes back to what we started at the beginning, what happened? Who are you? What things are affecting you? And understanding their lens of focus of the world can really get down to a proper diagnosis for what their symptoms are presenting.
Thank you. The next question, I'm gonna kind of bounce around a little bit. So oftentimes, the Black community or Black individuals are stereotyped as being angry. And at the same time, they're experiencing a lot of trauma, as we've been talking about all evening. So how can we see Black individuals as hurt beings?
I think what we have to do is we do have to see Black individuals as hurt beings, but we're not just hurt beings. We are whole beings. We are beings with joy, with love, with resiliency. We're complete. We're not just hurt. And I think a lot of times individuals may look at us as just hurt, which is doing us a disservice. We are way more than that, but we are hurt. And I think that we have to address that. So to answer the question is to see us as hurt beings is to see us as full beings, as whole beings.
I love that, Brian. All right. Anyone else want to answer? All right. So we'll go ahead. Next question. How would you define empathy versus sympathy? And how important do you think either or both are to interacting with Black clients?
So I would define sympathy as feeling pity, compassion, feeling sorry for someone's unfortunate circumstance. Whereas empathy, I would see it as using your imagination to put yourself in the other individual's shoes, to feel what they may be feeling. One actually drives or promotes connection. Well, empathy promotes connection. You're trying to feel what they're feeling. You're trying to connect with them. And the other one, sympathy, I do think that there may be space for that with empathy, but empathy is definitely essential, it's pivotal to working with people of color, in my opinion, due to the fact that it does promote that connection and us feeling completely like humans and seen once again.
Absolutely. Coming from an empathetic heart really drives the notion that we're seen. Because oftentimes, especially in the media, like our stories are not seen for the positive. How often you hear in the news that, there's more positive stories about Black community and their mental health and the trauma they face on the day in and day out. And so from an empathetic lens, we hold that space in the clinical, setting to say, we see you. We don't see the color, so to speak, of your skin as the barrier of your story. We see it as, that you're more than just what everyone sees on the outside. My name is Taylor. I'm going to understand Taylor. Yes, you're a Black female, but there's more to you than just your identity of that. Like, Brian was saying about the intersectionality, is that empatheticness, holds that space for it.
And I'll add to that, another part of this, right, is that when we are providing sympathy, sometimes we're overwhelmed, right? So when I think of sympathy when working with people of color, I think of almost like white fragility, right? That it somehow results in us holding space for you as you have realized that there are some instances where you've been unkind, right? And we get that, right? But we really want you to understand our experience, which is more of that empathy, right? That you are, as Brian said, putting yourself in our shoes and understanding. But one of the things I think is important, especially for clinicians in this space, is that we're mindful that to no fault of anyone here's own, right, is that the institutions and the learning, especially if you think about the testing that we do, a lot of that is our founders of theories are all white males, right? And so that's what we're tested on. That's what we have to know. We got to know Maslow. We got to know Freud. We have to know Erik Erikson and all these things, right? But we really don't get a good foundation of Black theorists. And so one of the things, going back to what many of my colleagues have said on here, is reading, right? Take a look at the literature and see if you are ever grabbing those books where we have Black scholars really highlighting the Black experience and linking it to our psyche and the impact that the Black experience has had on our psyche. I think that that's probably the most powerful thing that you can do to move from this space of sympathy to empathy, right? Is to really understand it and immerse yourself in that literature, right? So you have our Dr. Akbar's, we have, again, I mentioned Dr. Joy DeGruy. You can read some books by Angela Davis. You can read The New Jim Crow. There's just so much that you can do to really kind of understand how we have really become traumatized through that experience. So I think that will really help to move again from sympathy to empathy with that.
We also be careful with empathy, because a way that empathy could be misused is for folks to say that they completely understand someone's experience, and you just don't, in a way, So just be very careful with that. Yeah, I've seen that come up a lot, and it could be re-traumatizing for someone who's trying to open up to you and connect with you. But do definitely attempt to heal someone and understand as much as you can from their perspective without saying, you know, I understand completely. This happens to me, by the way, all the time. All the time there's someone on a call. You know, I talk about my story a lot to help, you know, destigmatize these things. By the way, Dr. Peters mentioned those Black authors. I'm one of them. So please feel free to use reference my stuff if you can. But you know, I talk about this really traumatic 10 ACEs story about homelessness and growing up in homeless shelters. And the last time I told this story, people were crying, and one person got up and said, I grew up very wealthy, and I remember that, you know, we had a horse. And I was like, oh my God. She said, we had a horse and something happened with the horse, and it reminded me of your story. I said, oh my God. Yeah, that you just didn't fully understand me, right? So it's like, don't compare me to not get the horse, the pony that you wanted, the pony that you had got sick. But I do acknowledge that, okay, that's your trauma. You're trying to connect with me. But it's that's empathy gone wrong, so to speak.
Thank you. So we're gonna ask one more question to the panelists that we've identified, and then there's a few questions in the chat we want to try to get to as well. So last question, how do you help Black clients find their own strengths to assist them in their healing?
So I'll try to be brief because I always feel like I'm long-winded, but what I'll say is that number one, you want to ask them, again, we are a very creative people, and healing looks different depending on who you're talking to. So we have individuals who are writers, who are not writers, who like music, again, who are storytellers, who use their spirituality. And so I think that when we are working with people of color, the Black and Brown community, you really want to, in that first session, right, we're supposed to be doing a biopsychosocial assessment anyway. We're really supposed to be getting to know them, right? So you want to find out what has worked, what are those healing practices, but be open to learning that it won't look like what it looks like for you, right? You know, we do a lot of cooking. We heal through food. We just heal through just showing up for each other. Sometimes what you may consider a natural support, my sister may not be my blood sister, right? So it boils down to, there's so many things, right, that are important to us, that are strengths to us in our community, that you may have to ask, how can we build that better? And I'm sorry, I'm sneezing, so. But I think that when we are assisting them with healing, you want to make sure that you really just ask that question directly, right? So what does healing look like for you before? What has helped you before? And figuring out how we can get you back into those spaces, and acknowledging that that is healthy practices. We do want to be mindful of the Black and Brown community of the substance misuse, and challenging that. But beyond that, I think it is worth a conversation when you're working with your clients in a true dialogue.
Awesome. So the panelists are okay with it, just for the sake of time, I really want to try to get to a couple of the questions. I do want to acknowledge the first question was, I believe, answered. What are some of the good questions to get the conversation started? I think Dr. Peters talked about just asking, how are you doing? These events are happening. Let's keep the elephant out the room. Brian talked about putting your differences on the table. And I think that's kind of, you all were weaving that in. So I want to acknowledge that. So I'm going to move on to the next question in the chat. Have therapists experienced, or have you all experienced, an uptake in clients since the pandemic? If so, what are the major themes?
I know for me, I've had an influx in Brown and Black, clients needing someone to vent. And the venting, you peel back the layers, is that, oh, this is vicarious trauma from everything that has gone on, not only just starting from George Floyd, but for the last 4 years with the past administration. So the thing for me with these new clients of mine is that they need someone to hold space with them, who will truly get them. Like what Mr. Johnson was saying, is like, I understand, and for my, minority clinicians, like, you may not fully understand their stories, but holding that space of empatheticness to have that space where they can share their frustrations, share the anger, share the sadness and despair and hopelessness. Because I have a lot of discussions of hopelessness, of just what is going on in the media, and seeing that who you thought were your friends and family were really not.
Brian, you're
And
muted.
you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to add to that and say, I work in corrections, and I have seen an increase in clients seeking mental health treatment inside a facility. And not only is the pandemic disproportionately affecting people of color, specifically Black people, in the jail system, how this goes back to systems and how everything is connected. In the jail, because of the disease, they have to go on lockdown, quarantine. So if they come into jail, they're not getting as much out time as usual. And this is actually impacting their mental health, of course. We're getting calls from families because it's impacting the families. They can't talk to their loved ones as much. So yeah, we're definitely, I just wanted to bring that up with that point of view, working in corrections, that even in corrections, we're seeing an increase in anxiety, increase in depression, specifically those two, due to the pandemic.
Thank you. We're going to move on to another question in the chat. How do you broach the subject when you think another non-BIPOC clinician is not competent in working with BIPOC clients, but they think that they are? So that's an interesting question. I'll let you all take that.
Well, I think that is very interesting. I think for me, it would be having a conversation one-on-one. Hopefully you have some kind of rapport with, this clinician, where you see them, they're saying things in their personal life that may not agree with their clinical life. And so kind of, pull them aside, having like a deep conversation, place, of compassion, to say, hey, I have some concerning things. I noticed what you, for example, post on Facebook and Instagram doesn't necessarily align with what we're trying to do in our clinical setting, and having that as a starting point for discussion.
I'm gonna sound like such a therapist right now, but use those I statements, because I oftentimes I think I want to validate that concerns. I think it happens on both sides, right? But we want to make sure that we are acknowledging that we're human as clinicians. And so when you are seeing your peer say something that's uncomfortable, it's okay to say, you know what, I hear you discussing that client, and I, as a Black woman, don't feel supported when you say things like that about your client, right? Because I feel this when you say this, right? So being mindful of conveying that, and we wanna correct it in love, but we want to have strong boundaries about what we will accept. And then this is a great space for our allies to come in, right? So if you identify yourself as an ally, or someone who is really pro changing these systemic issues, you too need to be in those spaces. I think sometimes for us, we are the only ones going, did you just hear that comment, right? But yet other people are in the room and no one is saying anything, right? So then it's like, well, now I seem like the angry Black woman clinician on the team. And so you want to be mindful that if someone is saying something that about a client or framing a client issue in a way that appears oppressive, racist, or prejudice in any way, that you make sure that you do pull them aside. If there's space for that conversation in the room, you want everyone to say something. And you don't want to have that bystander effect, because really that when you don't say anything, it's like when you see something, say something. Everybody's doing it for, like, if you're leaving your luggage at the airport or if there's some crime, but when there are issues of racism, it's like, ooh, if you see something, don't say something. And that's just not working for me. So I am sure that it is not working for the individual who put that in the comment box.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I do want to acknowledge there was one more question in the chat we're not going to have time to get to this evening. However, Jaleesa put something in the chat for some resources, and we're going to start wrapping up now.
Yes, this was an amazing presentation. Thank you to our 4 panelists. It was great. I hope everybody took little nuggets with them and something that they can take for themselves for later. I know I did. I was taking notes, so I appreciate everybody for coming in. I put a reminder for the CEUs. Again, any questions, you can email ce@mhccf.com. And on behalf of MHCCF as well as CFAMFT, we truly enjoyed co-hosting this special event and look forward to sharing with you more amazing presentations. So take care and self-care. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And don't forget, we have the resource list